Welcome to this week's show series. We have some lights on in the studio today, and you can tell the difference. So I always like to give you different perspectives, like empower you to know you can film your show anywhere. But obviously, if you turn on nice lights and think a little bit more about framing and lighting, you'll get a more beautiful product. And that's not always the most important thing, especially if you have an audio first show, but sometimes it matters. And you may notice yourself perceiving me differently during this video because the lighting is better and the resolution is better. Just a fun fact to keep in mind, not to make you think you have to, but know that there's always options to increase the quality of your perception. And that is kind of a topic I want to cover today on this week's show host series, because I think in an election year in the US, we think a lot about perception, right? We see a ton of media created around political candidates and how they're perceived on TV, in person, on print ads and radio and everything. And I think even though at Worthville Media, we create podcasts and YouTube shows and live event programming for personal brands who typically aren't trying to win a presidential election, we are very much in the business of helping our clients match their public persona, who they appear to be in the world, to the content that we're making with them. And for most people, that's pretty close to who they are at home or quote unquote in real life. But the truth is, public personas are very useful and can be very protective depending on the kind of industry you work in or the kind of profession you work in. It can be really helpful to have a little bit of a public persona that's slightly different, or maybe an abbreviated version of your full beautiful self that you share with friends and family at home. And today I want to talk about perception of your public persona as a show host and how to thoughtfully and strategically use that to share your message with your audience, and kind of healthy boundaries, I think, is the buzzword we would use to describe why it's important to consciously choose the public persona you're going to have, whether it's the same person that you are all the time or whether it's a little different or maybe it's a lot different. Because over time, the more you create content online, whether that's a podcast or a YouTube show or social media content or written content or emails, whatever, over time, people come to know you as your public persona, right? If hundreds or thousands of people or millions of people follow your thought leadership, we're using a lot of lingo today, but it's what is used in the industry, they will create a persona in their minds of who you are, right? And there's no way for that persona to be the exact same person that you are in real life, because your content does not reveal all of who you are. That would be impossible. And if you tried to be 100% authentic to every facet of your being in your content made for thought leadership in your profession, that wouldn't work. So in the effort to be as authentic as possible and as ethical and as aligned as possible with your true identity, I think when you're making content, it's well worth it to just stop first. And it's a great conversation to have with a producer, your team, maybe your marketing person, to really decide what's the persona that we want to publicly share with our audience about me as the show host. And this is pretty specific to show hosts. I mean, it's applicable in many ways. But today I'm specifically talking to show hosts because if you aren't thoughtful and strategic about the public persona you're deciding to share with your audience, it doesn't mean you won't have one. It means that you won't have control of it. It may be subconscious, and you may not realize years down the road, oh, that's the way I was showing up and that's what people perceived me. And that's not exactly, I wish I would have changed a few things. I wish I would have been more thoughtful, maybe shared more, maybe shared less of other pieces of me, so that the public persona people gathered from all of my content is what I feel most in integrity with. So a couple basics to go over when we're thinking through these boundaries and these strategic pieces of your persona you're going to share as a show host. I've said this before in this series, but I'll say it again because I think it's so valuable. But I go back to some of Brene Brown's core principles. She has really strong boundaries. She's a researcher of human behavior and emotion. And she really has put this into practice herself as she's become a major thought leader globally around emotional intelligence. One is, Brene says, only share your story with those who've earned the right to hear it. And what I think that means in the context of podcasting is you can share a personal story from your life that's helpful or illustrative of a concept that you're trying to communicate, and it doesn't have to have all the details. There can absolutely be boundaries and limits on like what level of detail or intimacy you share in that story, appropriate to the audience you're sharing it with. And it is really important to honor those boundaries, because I've seen this time and again with show hosts where they've felt this sort of ethereal pressure to like share everything, be explicitly truthful about an experience they had or a situation that they want to like share as an illustrative concept, and they regret it later. Like it was too vulnerable. It felt unsafe. Maybe they got pushback or feedback that was inappropriate because the people receiving the story didn't understand the full context of you shared so much, and they didn't understand all the other pieces around it, and so they took it wrong. I feel like you can probably think of some examples to relate from your own life or thought leaders you followed. So the first thing I always encourage when I'm talking to teams about like how do we build the public persona of the show host is like what has the audience earned the right to hear? Because a public audience, like if we're speaking of just like a podcast that's available to anyone and is not like behind a paywall or subscriber only or something, just for a community or like internally within a company, the public has like not earned the right to, hear all that much. And you can be generous, but you certainly don't have to share everything because it wouldn't make sense. Like they wouldn't get it. So think about how much your audience already knows about you, like what is already common knowledge that you've shared, and is there anything additional you want to bring in that would help them get a better picture of you as the thought leader, or like, is that it? Like, these are the boundaries. Like, here are the pieces that we share about yourself as a show host, and here's the pieces we don't. And for some people that looks like, I share a lot about my career, but I don't share about my family. Some people it's like I share a lot about my family, but I don't share about my marriage, or I don't share about my kids until they're adults or something like that. It could also be maybe you had a really tough time in your history. Maybe you're struggling with recovery or sobriety or a major, emotional breakdown or meltdown. And maybe you're a lot more thoughtful about what you share from that period because the person you are now would be hard for people to reconcile with that version because we've all been through rock bottoms. But I've heard so many people share their rock bottom stories on podcasts, and I can always tell when they've thoughtfully decided what pieces are appropriate to share with the general public and what pieces they keep to a private circle versus people who literally just like share a lot. And I've seen kind of the consequences of that. Sometimes there's regret after, or just like a vulnerability hangover that's not really productive or helpful. So think about how much of your story of you as a human you're going to share with this public audience. And two, the second thing I would consider when you're building this public persona as a show host is what is the most valuable insight I can share while still respecting that the audience doesn't want to know everything. It can be tempting to be like, if I just like really open my heart, people will understand me. Like, that's not true. And we know in the age of media that's oftentimes very short and focused, most people's attention spans aren't going to sit there for a longer explanation of all the nuances of maybe why you did something you did or why you think what you do. Sometimes that's more appropriate for like a book or a really long form series. And even then that can be tricky. And so I would just be really thoughtful about like what level of vulnerability and like human connection will be helpful to my audience and what level will kind of like open a can of worms that I can't manage. So in concrete terms, I would say something like, let's say you're a show host and your show is about, leadership for executives who are going through major pivots. Maybe it's called like the pivot point. And you've had like a 30-year career of guiding executives and being an executive yourself and pivoting many times, like changing organizations' directions or something like that. Obviously, there can be really helpful insight you can share from your personal experience. Like I was having to present to the board and the stakeholders, and I had this huge proposal, and I didn't know how it was going to go down, and I was so sweaty and nervous. And I went to the bathroom beforehand, and I like took a Xanax, and then it turned out to be terrible because I forgot I had coffee, and like never do that. Like that could be like a humorous, funny, real life situation that people can relate to that wasn't like horribly personal. And then that could be a really helpful illustration to lead into maybe a principle around like what I learned from that experience is you have to prepare yourself in very healthy, mindful ways when you're going to go present in a high stakes meeting and you're going to be nervous. And what I've learned to do is meditate and run and journal and drink green juice or whatever. Like that could be a great level of detail versus you might be really tempted to be like, and you know what else? My wife and I were on the brink of a divorce, and my kid was struggling in school, and I had another kid who'd just gotten into drugs, and I just felt like I'd been contemplating suicide. Like I'm getting really dramatic here, but sometimes you'll hear people share like every possible little detail, and that opens just so many questions for the listeners. Like, well, what? Like, what was even going on? Like, were you stable? Like, were you on drugs? Like, what happened? Like, see how that can just like kind of explode into more questions than like your content's ready to answer. So I just want to give you that like kind of made up example to help you think through like, what is the appropriate level? What can my audience properly infer from my story based on the information they have, or what's the little bit of insight or humor or vulnerability I can give that's like going to help them relate and learn from the story versus like spiral out into like, who even is this person? And like, I have so many questions. So those are two helpful points that I hope you can take away from today's video about like how to kind of build a public persona as a show host, thinking about how much of your story your audience has earned the right to hear, and then what's actually the helpful level of personability or vulnerability to share with them as a thought leader so that they can relate to you and follow along with your content without getting like spiraled into, places that you don't have a way to share the full story with them. I hope this was helpful. If you have questions, leave one in the comment. Subscribe to the channel because we'll bring new videos weekly with more tips for show hosts. But I think this is a timely topic to cover as we think about, the loudness of political personas in our society in the US and around the world. I know for a lot of people that can be a real turnoff. Like, I don't want to make media. I don't want to be lumped in with what I see on, TV or wherever. But the truth is, like, you can create really positive messaging and influence with your media, and you can be really thoughtful about the persona you share with the public. But it's worth it to pause and think through it and talk to a producer or talk to your team and really make some like good boundaries for yourself before you start creating content. And then you'll be in a much better place going forward. So hope that was helpful. We'll see you in the next video.